Greetings and welcome to In Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. Looking forward to this conversation. We're going to premise it when we actually start speaking with the guest, but looking at issues of gender inside of the carnival. And we're doing so with senior lecturer at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies, Dr. Gabrielle Hosein. How do you do,
Hi
Dr.
there.
Hosein?
I'm well. Looking forward to Carnival.
As many of us. But even before, and I'm grateful that you use the word carnival, because this is not necessarily a conversation about carnival per se, as opposed to issues of gender within carnival. And I'm trying to set that rubric and set the parameters so that we have an idea of expectations. We're limiting our expectations correctly as we go forward. But even as we go forward, I'd ask you to give words in terms of the contribution, the legacy of Professor Gordon Rohlehr to this space, to academia, and to helping us see ourselves.
I think it is impossible to theorize Carnival, not just Calypso and music, but it is impossible to think about Carnival without citing the works of Professor Gordon Rohlehr. Professor Rohlehr has been publishing for decades, and he really introduced the idea of bringing popular forms such as Calypso into an academic domain, seeing them as forms of cultural commentary and seeing them as ways of understanding the society. He, of course, was a scholar of other things such as cricket, but today we're talking about Carnival. And I feel like there are Caribbean intellectuals who introduce a way of us seeing ourselves that provides a gift for us to always return to be reminded of that way of seeing. And Professor Gordon Rohlehr epitomizes that in his work. And indeed, a lot of my ideas about Carnival and some of the commentary that I've been doing this year is really his ideas that I've drawn on to then make those analyses. And so I want to credit him. I want to honor him. I want to remember him. And just to remind ourselves that he may be gone, but his writing is always here for us to return to, his vision and his voice.
And it is a beautiful thing to be able to, like you said, use the narrative of ourselves to describe and articulate positions, as opposed to going outside in a sense of seeking validation for different things. But to be able to literally look to the mirror and use that image to say, okay, well, yes, this is what is good, and this can also withstand the scrutiny of academic rigor. But with regard to that.
No, I wanted to say the other thing is that when we look outside, we use outside standards for understanding what is art, what is philosophy. And, if you hear Peter Minshall talking about his band Red, he will say that you can go in a museum and you can see a painting, the painting is red, and the painting just is not created by living bodies in the street. And that what he is doing along with the mass players in that band is art. It's not art you would see in the Louvre, but it is art that is so much more. And so when we use other standards, we miss the unique, amazing, creative, collective enactment of those things that in fact are just grounded in how we function. And similarly with philosophy, so that we can look to popular forms such as Calypso and music as forms of reflecting and theorizing who we are in our society.
And looking at those popular forms, be it the music, be it the art enacted on the streets, what are some of those issues of gender that are posed, the questions that are asked during this period of Carnival?
Oh, well, gender is the fundamental, to my mind, the fundamental point of contestation in Carnival at every Carnival, has been for hundreds of years. So we all know, for example, the age-old debate about vulgarity and lewdness, which amazingly has come up again in the Carnival regulations, which are outlawing something that is considered to be lewd and indecent, and is such a colonial framing of a joyous, exuberant sexuality as a form of self-expression, as a form of sovereignty, as a form of freedom. So that question of control of women's bodies and women's sexuality is age old, and is such a fundamental one in Carnival. Another one that I'm going to point to, again, that has to do with gender and sexuality is, on the other hand, the marketing and commodification of women's bodies. So, for example, when you see tourist marketing, you will see tourist marketing of the Carnival Bikini Mas body. And that Bikini Mas body that you would see in big Carnival tourist and product advertisements, such as for rum and for alcohol, and by big corporate sponsors, that female Carnival bikini body is appropriate to be commodified once it stays within a nation state corporate narrative of what its meanings and what its representation are supposed to be. Once that body steps out of state and corporate control and exercises freedom, joy, pleasure, autonomy, sexuality on its own terms, it suddenly becomes too much. And so there is a great tension that we see both in women expressing their own sexuality and freedom and sexual freedom, but also the tension of how it is constantly commodified and packaged, both by the corporate sector, by the state, but also by the male gaze.
And the main reason that I reached out to you to have this conversation was someone breaking with that commodification, or rather doing it on their own terms. And that would have namely been Patrice Roberts, that reinterpretation of Penguin's Soft Man. And even before we get directly into the issues that are encapsulated within that song, how important, because you wrote an article on it, how important was it that you state that the original song was coming from the context of a certain time and space, this time specifically being 1984?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you, when I heard the song, and it brought back the idea of a soft man, because I'm a scholar of masculinity and I'm interested in popular engagements with masculinity, I immediately wanted to comment. Well, more, not so much comment. I wanted to reflect on what the song was doing. I immediately went and I read Gordon Rohlehr's writing on masculinity and Calypso. How is masculinity expressed? How is it contested? What are the roles of women Calypsonians' voices in that kind of quote unquote battle of the sexes, and so on? And it's from Rohlehr's writing, his article in Rhoda Reddock's collection, Interrogating Masculinities from 2004, that I took many of the ideas from that piece. Indeed, Rohlehr writes about Penguin. He goes through that song in particular, talking about how Penguin wrote the song because he spoke to women who were saying that they had a nostalgia for a particular kind of dominant manhood, a man's man. And they didn't want to be men to be quote unquote soft men. Now, of course, the soft man is not just soft as in doing domestic housework, being a house husband, being under the rule of a woman, and so on. The soft man's softness is also a reference to the penis or phallus. The phallus is the male erect penis. The male erect penis is a symbol of power. That's why it's, symbolized by the gun, by the, slam, by beating, and all of those kinds of things. So it's also a statement to women wanting to have that wicked Islam, that length and strength, that 10 furlong, that potency bordering on violence that is symbolized by the phallus. So it's really interesting that women were considered to be expressing this by Penguin in 1984. And we hear women saying that today. Women yearn for traditional masculinity in the same way that men yearn for traditional femininity. That, anybody could like anybody, right? We're not out here to control who anybody desires. But of course, all notions of gender are shaped by a larger system, a larger ideological system of our beliefs and values, and a larger system, whether it's in the economy or in law or in society, that rewards some form and exalts some forms of masculinity over others. So when I went back to Rohlehr, what was important about his writing was that he was pointing to this moment in history when masculinity was being considered to be emasculated, which incidentally is right at the moment of the birth of the myth of male marginalization.
And with that, we take a short break, we return to this conversation, and I'm just happy to get back to it with Dr. Gabrielle Hosein. Stay with us, we return with more. Welcome back. We are speaking with Senior Lecturer at the IGDS, Dr. Gabrielle Hosein, and looking at that moment of male masculinity, or the concept of it, almost like feeling emasculated. Dr. Hosein, there are Calypsonians that I like because they are comfortable enough within themselves to say, okay, well, they were on the quote-unquote losing end of an encounter. So there's Black Prince talking about fry balls, where he thought that there was someone who was pregnant by him. There is Kid Callaloo, who the first lines in one of his songs, he starts off, I am a bad lucky fella when it comes to the female sex. You see, I'm not so clever. Sometimes I always get myself vexed. And they are comfortable enough within themselves to be able to take that position, as opposed to, I am always the dominant person. I always have this erect phallus with which I wield my power. But speaking about power, though, how does the updated version of Soft Man, the one by Patrice Roberts, how does it treat with some of those kind of gender normative roles and behaviors that would have been discussed in one, the previous version, and two, just society as a whole at this point in time?
Sure. So what intrigued me about that song was not only why it would bring back this tribute to Penguin, but what it did, but also the ways that it was received. So there were people who felt that the song was emasculating and should not have been brought back because it was wielding an obsolete narrative, whether that narrative was to emasculate men or to ask for more dominant masculinity. And it's wanting to see, I think Patrice is an excellent Calypsonian. and I find her writing to be very interesting. And I wanted to really listen to the words of the piece to see what she was trying to say before judging. And it is such a fantastic, interesting song. And she is consistently in it saying, I am already dominant. I am not looking for a dominant man. I am looking for a man who is able to meet me at the standard that I am at, who is able to be an equal to me. She says it repeatedly. She says, if he says go one way, I'm going to go another way. If he tells me to be quiet, I am going to talk. She also at the same time puts down a dominant manhood by saying, well, and you also see this in the video, right? Dominant men such as the coach in the gym who just doesn't have, she smirks at the screen as he's trying to show his strength against her. Again, this kind of derisive look at a particular kind of masculinity. And then she takes men. It's really interesting. There's two men in particular. One is a man who should have defended a woman, and the other is a man who should have changed a flat tire. And she looks at the women who have to defend themselves and who have to be capable themselves. And what's interesting is I don't think she's saying that the man should have changed the tire and not the woman. And I don't think she's saying the man should have fought on behalf of the woman. I think she's saying here are two instances where men cannot even do what women can do. And so these men are in a way not worth our time. And then the other thing, and again, this is Rohlehr, is that Calypso operates in parallel with the Gael, with the stick fight. And so we also have to understand that Calypso is not out here to just be sweet and loving. It was out here to be a form of lyrical wordplay, to be lyrical battle, to be one-upmanship also in terms of the quality of the writing and its references to what's happening, as well as the battles with others who were looking to be the best in the society. And so she is a Calypsonian, in a sense, throwing words to those who cannot be her match and saying, well, look how you are soft because you cannot even change a tire. You cannot even fight like us. You cannot even, and remember traditionally, you're not supposed to be anything like, you're not supposed to fight like a girl. You're not supposed to do things like a girl. And so this way that she is stepping out of an idea of male dominance and looking for an idea of male capacity or male equality, or just men who one can rely on to be able to operate at the same level. I think that's a really interesting expression at this moment.
And even in that expression, I have no real comment on the changing of the tire, but that exchange with the person who didn't defend his ladyship's honor. What I find interesting about that is I even bring the notion of the Jamet into that in terms of like individuals on the outside. If that man started an altercation with a person, I think there may have been different results. So if his friends are around, they then use that as an excuse to jump in and to escalate that entire situation, as opposed to the person who was wrong, the lady who was wrong, she rests her hand on that brother.
Yes.
And it done right there after the laugh at him.
This is it. The other thing is that the men that are viewing and laughing are really important, because men gain or lose status in the eyes of other men as well. And so it's not just how are they seen in the eyes of women, it is can they compete in the world of men to be recognized as being an appropriate kind of man. I do want to say, though, that for women in general and women in Calypso, they are expected to be not just sexy and loving and attractive and all of those kinds of things, but when they are not, when they are Jamettes, that is, they jump into a stick fight and they want to play and they want to win and they want to mobilize those traditional strategies of masculine battle, they are often seen as being too much. And what I appreciated about Patrice's song and others out there is that she was wielding typical masculine forms in Calypso, doing it as a woman and doing it in a way that was highly nuanced. And the other interesting thing is at the end of the video, there's a line that says these were not, and none of these men were soft men, they were just actors. And I thought that was also quite brilliant, because what she's saying is that this video is looking at a performance of femininity against a performance of masculinity. Again, it's the Gael. But what happens outside is a different story, is a different negotiation, is a different kind of love, but also world of transformation.
And I really appreciate the way that you talk about negotiation, and this will actually go into the other side of the conversation, because if you're looking on television, we invite you to actually look on digital platforms. We're going to continue a little past this because I like Oliver Twist asking for some more. But even the notion that for one to be empowered, someone needs to have power removed from them, I think is very important. And there is another song, like if we go to Jamaica and we look at Ramping Shop with Spice and Vybz Kartel, neither is backing down, each is empowered, and they come to a place of contestation that is friendly, that is not putting down one person or the other. If we look at it with Patrice Roberts again, Patrice Roberts and Marshall Montano, where they have the temper wine, where Patrice tells Marshall, you stand up with your hand there full like a shutter. If I put it on you, you're going to melt like butter. What you're going to do when I give you the temper wine? But we continue the conversation when we return. If you're looking from television, we thank you so much. And on behalf of the entire TTT News team, I'm Dike Rostant. We've been speaking with Dr. Gabrielle Hosein, a senior lecturer at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the UWI St. Augustine campus. Thank you so much for tuning in. And if you are looking at us here, this means that you are on a digital platform. Thank you so much for staying with us. We're speaking with Dr. Gabrielle Hosein, and we're looking at issues of gender in the carnival, in the space. And just before we finished on the other side of the break, Dr. Hosein, looking at negotiation and the fact that every conversation includes levels of power. Who has the power to do this? Who has the power to do that? Who has the power to say, if you tell me hush, you're talking? And some of these even are political acts. So you spoke of how it is the male is seen by the woman, how the male is seen by his male contemporaries. And yes, continuing though, Bikini Mas, how can Bikini Mas be likened to a political act, or how is it a political act?
So let's talk about Bikini Mas. Now, what's really interesting is that there have been movements in the US and North America and so on to have women be safe on the streets regardless of how they are dressed. And those have been called slut walks, and they've had various terms. I think, as always in the majority world, what's known as the third world, or the global south, we are often ahead of the movements that happen in North America, but we don't credit ourselves for the movements happening on our terms. And I think that the movement of Bikini Mas since the 1980s has been an extremely political, mass-based, collective push for women to be safe in public, regardless of how they are dressed or how they behave or how much they drink. Now, we know that fighting rape culture is about saying, regardless of what state a woman is in, how she dresses, where she goes, what time she is out, or anything else, she is not asking to be raped. That is taking away her right to decide what happens to her own body. And that discourse has come to us now. We're quite familiar with it, even though there's lots of work to be done. However, I think, Bikini Mas has typically been seen as apolitical, as the loss of politics in mass. And often women's politics are not considered political because they're not political on male terms. And sometimes they're challenging male power as well. But Bikini Mas, which has always been seen as apolitical, is actually been a movement of 10,000 or more women a year, however many, thousands of women a year, that each year are insisting against the tradition of rape culture that they should be safe if they're near naked, right? If they're drinking alcohol, if they're out late at night, if they're enjoying their bodies, if they're being sexual. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And we can see the knockoff effects on the larger society as women more and more, and men, learn that this is something that must be respected. And then we hear it in the calypso, we hear it in that, can I ask if I could dance with you? Can I come up to you and get you to say yes? And so we are now seeing it being expressed in the Calypsonians. There's one last point I want to make about gender and sexuality, and that gets to the commodification. I've been looking at some of the videos, and by Patrice, also by Nyla Blackman, but in general, and it's the introduction of the strip club and the stripper pole to representations in Carnival. And I wrote about this a number of years ago when Bungie sang Red Light District. And I wrote about it very critically because for me, the idea of women whining in Carnival is that it's a freedom. You are not performing it for anybody. You're performing it for the enjoyment of your own body and its self-determination. When that gets translated and represented and commodified in terms of the performance of a stripper on a pole, she is performing it for somebody else's pleasure. At this point, she is working literally to please somebody else. To me, that it becomes a misrepresentation and a prime example of commodification. And we see that in a number of videos that are emerging where there is that move from a free definition, a free expression of sexuality, to one that is quite obviously being performed for a male viewer and his pleasure. And I see that in a number of videos. I think it's quite problematic, and I think there's a lot more for us to think about around that issue.
And you say these things, and you have me going in different directions. One, in terms of being ahead of the curve, and then someone else taking it, putting a name on it, and because they tell the story, they hold the narrative, they hold that level of power over the entire movement to certain degrees. And I'm also grateful for the level of nuance that you've brought to the conversation. So moving from self-determination and pleasing self to pleasing someone else, and just looking at how easy that transition can be, and sometimes it is not even realizing that, okay, well, we've moved from this realm to that. And
sure, it's necessary that we make the point, Dike, though, that there's nothing wrong with strippers. I just want to say I'm not judging anyone in the sex industry in saying that. I'm just speaking about what happens when you take a self-determination and commodify it so that it becomes performed for others' pleasure.
Yeah, man, and I get that, but just the point of knowing what it is you are articulating. So yes, it's being done consciously, as opposed to, well, I guess we could do this. Was this an idea for us to articulate in this way? But lastly, though, looking at how we've been having the nuance, having different articulations, and reframing or framing things in slightly different ways. I want you to do me the favor before we go and reframe that narrative that Hinduism and Carnival are cast as oppositional, specifically through the lens of the whip Princess Ranella Alfred. Thank you.
Well, this is another conversation entirely, but what I will say is that in terms of gender, that Ranella Alfred is doing really fascinating things in terms of the Jab Jab Mas, where she is invoking Kali, Mother Kali, Goddess Kali, in the context of carnival. A lot of people don't understand that mask making is not the same as mask playing. Traditional mask makers treat their craft as an art, as a discipline, as a love, as a labor. It's connected to the ancestors. It's connected to their, it is treated very seriously. And so when you come to carnival as a mask maker, there's a level of sacrifice and there's a seriousness about it that we underestimate. What she is bringing, I think, is crucially, and just a crucial example of how Indian women may be engaging in the space that mass provides, but are doing it in ways that bring their Indianness with them. And in playing her Kali Jab Mas, she is invoking a legacy of what has come to her from India. She is defying patriarchal definition of when and where she can be spiritual, when and where she can connect to the divine feminine. And she is, I think, enacting what I would call post-indenture forms of feminism. That is an expression of self-determination that draws on the legacies of indenture. So all this to say that there is a lot in carnival that is happening with regard to gender, multiple ways, self-determination, commodification, ethnic crossing, invoking of spirituality. And finally, I just want to leave with reminding us that when we think about what's happening in culture, we can't just look at what's being said on a stage or whether it's being said by a woman or man. We also have to think about what's happening behind the scenes in a video. Who is the director? How are men controlling the production of the narrative and their own notions of gender shaping what should be portrayed? And for Ranella, how is her family's investment, long ancestral investment in Jab Jab Mas as Hindus in Trinidad, part of the backstory that explains why you will then see her as an Indian woman playing Jab Jab Mas on a stage, invoking Mother Kali in her representation. And to keep our analyses nuanced, to not look for simple narratives, and to remember also that things are often contradictory, which is exactly the point of carnival, is to hold those contradictions together in a way that allow us to see how they're being contested and worked through and enacted and performed.
We want to thank you so much, Dr.
My
Hosein,
pleasure.
Dr. Gabrielle Hosein. And if you've stayed with us till the end, we want to thank you as well. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been In Depth with me, Dike Rostant, looking at issues of gender within the carnival space and how we can bring a little more awareness to what it is we see when it is we see it. Thank you again for joining us.